History has always validated Western Kenya's Nabongo Mumia as the greatest king of the Abawanga.
Okay, so today I want to talk about a war. A war that whenever I look into it, seems like nothing that has ever happened in Kenya because nobody talks about it. Yet it's something that has been building up for I think around 200 years. Yes, 200 years in Kenya, because this war, as far as I can trace it back, it traces back to like the 17th century. And it also involves some anomalies, well, according to the British people, anomalies that were in Kenya, considering the fact that there was an entire kingdom inside Kenya, the Abawanga kingdom. And this is the story of how the Abawanga kingdom and the Bukusu people ended up having one of the most devastating wars that happened inside Kenya, and it was one of the most unexpected ones because whenever you look into it, it literally has the same fighting situations as World War I, which happened 20 years later after this war. So to start off, we have the whole situation of the Wanga kingdom and the Bukusu people, right? But we cannot know how these struggles started without knowing how this kingdom and these people actually started in the first place. And let's start with the Wanga because their origin story is a little bit weird. So whenever you look into the whole story about the Wanga people, their origins trace back to a certain place called Misri. Yes, according to their oral traditions and all that, they originated from Misri. And their leader, who went by the name Wanga, who led these people all the way from Misri all the way towards Uganda. And this was in the 13th to the 14th century. Yes, 13th to the 14th century. Although in contrast, whenever you look at their migration patterns, they are said to have migrated from a certain area in the Congo basin and then went towards Misri before coming to Uganda. But there is a lot of common nature between the whole story about Misri because the leader Wanga is said to have been one of the royals in Misri. So now they migrated in the 13th and 14th century and they came to Uganda. And they established the Wanga kingdom at first in Uganda. And then they stayed there for like around 200 years till the 16th century. And they were thriving and they were starting to dominate, right? But then came the first encounter between them and the Bukusu. And there was no war. If anything, it was even more peaceful than anybody expected. So the Bukusu people around this same time were starting to migrate all the way from the Congo basin towards Kenya, right? And they went through Uganda, and this is where the first interactions between them and the Wanga people happened. And it was actually okay because at this time the Wanga people weren't like completely centralized. As much as they had this basic structure of what a monarchy would be like, they weren't actually that invested that much into it. This happened later on, like 50 years after the interaction with the Bukusu. And the Bukusu were okay with them because the Bukusu themselves were not centralized at all. They were living mostly in warrior clans, like in clans that were mostly fortified by warriors. Heck, and they related actually pretty well. There were actual intermarriages between these two people. But then also the same period in time, there were also multiple kingdoms within Uganda, which current day Uganda, right? And there was so much pressure on these two groups, mostly, especially the Wanga people, because they just couldn't relate with these people that much. So they decided to move much more south and entered into Kenya and then settled in modern day Mumias. And that is where they decided to settle and dominate that area. But the Bukusu people, they didn't move that south as the Wanga people. They moved linearly, and at some cases they moved towards the upper side, and that is why most of them are around Trans Nzoia and around Mount Elgon, because that is where they saw like they could last for longer. Because if you go to the south, there's a monarchy there. You go to where Uganda is, there's a monarchy there. So that is where the easiest place that they could have found. And now these people have been separated in the 16th century, but then the Wanga people established their monarchy and it becomes so dominant on Western, and then comes the Arabs. So the Arabs entered into the East African coast around the late 17th century. At this time, this whole 100-year period, ever since the Wanga people had moved, they had established such a dominant kingdom to the point that they were starting to conquer their neighbors. And yes, they conquered a lot of land around the western region. And they also had very capable leaders. But also, as these guys were expanding, they were also expanding further south. They found out about the inland trade that was happening inside East Africa. And they saw it as an opportunity. And what did they do? They entered the trade because they had a lot of goods. But not only that, they also had slaves. Yes, they were among the first kingdoms inside Kenya to sell their slaves to the East African slave trade. And these slaves were gotten from every time they had a raid or when they conquered a certain land. They would conquer the land, and then the weak people and everybody that lost, the strong males would actually be sold as slaves, and the women were assimilated into their kingdom and whatever, make more babies, intermarriage, and you get the point, right? But then 100 years later, the Oman Arabs started coming into Kenya, right? And they started trading with these people. And not only did they trade with these people, they also ended up giving these people one of the most how do I put it? One of the most substantial things that changed the face of Mumias forever. They brought religion. And that is when the Arabs and Islam came into Kenya. So the Arabs were very welcome into the Wanga kingdom, and they actually resorted to using the Wanga kingdom at multiple times as one of their outposts whenever they're trading inside Kenya, whenever they're moving inside Kenya towards the Buganda kingdom, right? And so the Wanga people ended up gaining more and more fame and actually gaining more and more popularity and money, and they used this money to build their military well, and their military was strong. And remember, whenever a country feels strong, and it was a country that was conquering other countries, it kept on conquering. And that is when we have our second encounter with the Bukusu people in around 17th century, in the 17th century. So remember the first time when these two encountered, it was all peaceful, right? Well, the second time they encountered, everything was different, because the Bukusu people had actually developed a mentality of independence and not relying on one specific leader. They believed more in being a community than being a kingdom, and they actually resented kingdoms. So the first interactions between the Wanga and the Bukusu around in the 17th century, it was not that peaceful, because the Bukusu did not want to trade that much with these guys because of the whole monarchical situation and all that, right? But then it actually got worse when a couple of Wanga warriors actually started raiding the Bukusu people, and it actually started pissing them off. And this led to the situation when the Bukusu people started building up their territories, building up their defenses. And they built strong defenses, so much so that it started actually troubling the Wanga people trying to penetrate them. And remember, these people are living in clans, so there was like one clan over there with their own defense, another clan over there with their own defense, and every single clan is decentralized but defended well. And this was something that the Wanga actually admired that much, but they hated it, mostly because they hated the fact that the Bukusu people loved themselves and did not want to interact with them again. So what did they do? They decided to want to conquer them. And it failed. It failed so miserably. Now remember this point that I'm about to tell you. In this period, most of the fighting was actually done with spears, swords, and sometimes arrows, right? So that meant most of the warfare was actually close combat, right? But then this warfare actually continued in the 18th century, and this warfare ended up continuing in the 18th century in the same way, like close-up combat. Until in the 18th century, something that wasn't supposed to happen and something that people don't usually talk about happened. The Arabs introduced guns. And yes, the Wanga people bought them. Although not a lot of guns were actually bought by the Wanga people, they bought enough to actually start subduing the Bukusu people and actually start turning the tides of war. And remember, this happened in the 18th century, 1700s. This was during the times of the Americans, when they were busy getting independence. Yes, that's how intense this whole situation was. And for like 100 years, the Wanga people were actually dominating because they were fighting and they were actually starting to push the Bukusu people out of their lands, right? And they pushed the Bukusu people up north towards Trans Nzoia and a little bit closer to Elgon, Mount Elgon. And some of them actually even moved into Uganda. But not all of them actually moved, because some of them actually decided to, you know what? They decided to get into the inland trade. Okay, they were in the inland trade, but not as much, because they actually value the independence more. But at some point they were like, F it, let's do it. And the first thing they do, they buy guns. The Bukusu people also buy guns, although not a lot of them, but some of them buy guns. And it actually turns the tides of the war between them. Now we are in the 1800s and there is a full-out war happening that is involving guns. 1800s inside Kenya. And at this point they were in a stalemate, because remember, the Bukusu people were originally stronger, and now that they've had all these guns and all that, it's been like that, right? But then in the next 50 years, by 1850, they not only had guns, they developed war tactics. Trenches. They used trenches. Do you know where else trenches were being used? In World War I. That is where trenches were being used. So now these two people are actually developing, they're actually developing a lot of war tactics that happened inside Kenya without any European influence, just Arab influence. And this war keeps on going and going and going until the worst thing happens. The British. The British end up entering Kenya, and the British have one thing on their minds. They want to dominate the inland trade inside Kenya. And to dominate trade, you will have to have a lot of outposts in every single major stopping point in the trade, which at that time included the Wanga kingdom. And this is where we find one of the most famous people in Kenyan folklore, Nabongo Mumias, because this was the time that he was thriving in the late 19th century, which is 1890s and 1880s. So at this point, the British have come to the Wanga kingdom and they are actually setting up treaties with the Wanga kingdom, right? And the British are actually shocked because they are a fully fledged kingdom, like they are such a centralized kingdom and it's working so well for them, right? But also at the same time, the British had But remember, at the same time, the British are also interacting with multiple Kenyan communities, which at one point included the Bukusu around the same time they were interacting with the Wanga. Now, Nabongo Mumia saw this as an opportunity because he actually saw the manpower that the British had. And it was not easy. It was not. The British had a lot of gunpowder, and he noticed that this could actually help him win the war against the Bukusu people. So according to these agreements, the British people were supposed to help the Wanga people to subdue the Bukusu people, and not only that, but also subdue most of the lands in the western region. And in return, they would help the British people to manage the area, and not only that, but help the British people have a massive say inside the inland trade, because remember, the Wanga people at this point in time were actually that much respected in the inland trade, you get? And so the British decide to make a deal with the Wanga people, and this is one of the first instances of collaboration inside Kenya. Now at the same time, the Bukusu people actually hear of this, and they hate the Wanga people, and this makes them to hate the British people. Also in this deal with the British, Nabongo Mumia also was able to get a couple of arms, artillery, but not only that, also cannons and a freaking Maxim gun. A Maxim gun is literally the predecessor to a machine gun. Do you know when all of this is happening? It is the 1890s, 20 years before even World War I happens. And this is actually happening inside Kenya. Now, the Bukusu were busy resisting the British, right? And then there was this chief who was basically the leader of one of the clans, and he did not like the whole situation of the British people being there. And it all climaxed when the British people tried to go through their land. And it got so heated up that this chief attacked the British men. And this led to the War of CHETAMBE, which happened in 1895. Now, describing this war is going to be I can't actually describe the whole war in detail, but I will tell you the whole setting of this thing is literally World War I. I don't even know how else to explain this. It is literally the setting of World War I. So how this war happened, the Wanga military, they had their guns, their artillery, their cannons and everything, right? So they decided to go on the offensive and entered into the Bukusu land in an area called in the CHETAMBE hills. Now the Bukusu people were very familiar with these hills and they decided to use these hills to their advantage. So what did they do? They set up blockades along the hills in places that they couldn't be easily seen. They had their own places, their own clans where they were living. The clans were fortified around, and not only that, they had trenches for moving forward in the offensive. That is a literal description of how the Bukusu were arranged. And the Wanga people here, they have guns, actually usable guns and actually good guns. They have cannons, they have freaking Maxim guns, basically a machine gun. They have British military officials that are actually helping them, but they also have British military tactics that they would later on use in World War I. Yes, this is an actual war that happened inside Kenya. Now, on the account of cannons and the Maxim guns, we all know that the Wanga people won. I mean, obviously, what do you mean? I'm fighting somebody with literal cannons and a machine gun. You expect things to go to my side? Obviously it didn't, and a lot of Bukusu people were actually murdered. Close to actually more than 700 in one day. And so the Wanga people had their first victory over this first clan. But it did not stop there. They kept raiding, and this time it was actually worse for the Bukusu because the Wanga people had their guns and all that, and they were busy raiding this side, and the British people were like, you know what, we want a little bit of fun, let's get into it. And the British people started attacking the Bukusu people, and it was just hell on earth for the Bukusu. So what the British were doing, they were attacking the Bukusu, displacing them, and then giving that land to the Wanga people for administration. And they ended up conquering a lot of lands in Western region. And I mean a lot. It got to a point where Nabongo Mumia was labeled as a paramount chief. But then you start to ask, a kingdom that has been dominant ever since the 14th century, all the way it's 1890s, and it's still dominant. We get into 1920s, Kenya becomes a colony, they're still dominant. How the hell did they actually collapse? So 1920, Kenya becomes a colony, and the British government actually decides to care that much about Kenya, and they realize one thing: these kingdoms might actually end up revolting at some point in time, when they realized the master plan of the British was to take over all this entire land for themselves. And they decided to do the best thing possible. They actually started funding the small insurgent groups inside the Wanga kingdom to actually revolt against the kingdom. But that happened after they removed this title of the paramount chief from Nabongo Mumia. So by the time Kenya gets independence, the Wanga people are all there, right? But it's actually so small. And the size of the kingdom is so small, it's actually like basically Mumia's alone and its surrounding areas. That is the whole kingdom. And then comes 1963, Kenya gets independence, Jomo Kenyatta becomes the prime minister. A year later, Jomo Kenyatta becomes the president of Kenya, and he outlaws every other single kingdom that exists inside Kenya. And the Wanga kingdom collapses, although it did not completely collapse, because when you look even to today, the title of Nabongo is still being used. The problem is it's actually used more like a clan king or something, not like a dominant king of a certain area. And yeah, they're still around. Surprisingly, I think you can go to Mumias and actually visit them. But every time I look into this story, I just realize how much we don't know about Kenyan history and the fact that we actually had a serious war inside Kenya and nobody talks about it. Well, all I'm saying is, as much as the British people keep on saying Africans were not dominant, Africans were so backwards minded, we had a lot of systems and we actually had a lot of situations. We had a lot of wars, we had a lot of peace treaties, we had a lot of negotiations, we had a lot of trade, and we had a lot of things that they only thought existed in Western communities. And that is the story of one of the most dominant kingdoms to ever exist in Kenya. And yeah, it's actually a very interesting story, and I'd advise you to look into it actually more. And one thing I could advise you, I'd advise you to go to Mumias and actually look at this Nabongo, because it's actually an important part of Kenyan history.